welcome you to this seminar in the MDH Modern Design History Lecture Series. I'm Michelle Major, and I teach here at the BGC, and I'm really delighted to introduce a longstanding friend and colleague, Dilys Blum. Dilys Blum is the Jack M. and Annette Y. Friedland Senior Curator of Costume and Textiles at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Dilys received her BA in Art History from Connecticut College and went on to do her graduate work in the UK. That included gallery and museum studies at the University of Manchester and conservation at the Courtauld Institute of Art. Before joining the PMA, Dilys held the positions of Textile Conservator at the Chicago Conservation Center, Senior Assistant Keeper of Costume and Textiles and Conservation Officer at the Museum of London, Textile Conservator at the Brooklyn Museum, Assistant Keeper of Decorative Arts at the Harris Museum and Art Gallery in Preston in the UK, and Photograph Cataloger at the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard. Since joining Contemporary Textiles, Costume and Fashion, she has written on a wide range of subjects, from African American quilts to fashion and surrealism. She was the curator of the acclaimed exhibition, Shocking, The Art and Fashion of Elsa Schiaparelli, 2003, Roberto Capucci, Art into Fashion, 2011, and most recently, Patrick Kelly, Runway of Love in 2014. And I wanted to just read to you a few of Dilys's publications that indicate this very wide range of material that she covers in her role as curator at the PMA. Desert Jewels, North African Jewelry and Photography from the Xavier Guérin Hermès collection. An Enduring Motif, The Pomegranate in Textiles, 2009 to 10. Shopping in Paris, that was a great show. French Fashion, 1850 to 1925. April to November 2009. These are exhibitions. Quilt Stories, the Ella King Torrey Collection of African American Quilts and Other Recent Acquisitions. That was 2008 to 2009. A Passion for Perfection, James Galanos, Gustav Tassel, Ralph Rucci, 2007 to 2008. Imagining Cathay, 18th and early 19th century chinoiserie textiles and embroideries from the collection. That was 2007-2008. Contemporary Fiber from the collection in the year 2000. And Ecclesiastical Vestments from the 14th through the 18th century in 1998-99. A number of those exhibitions have had accompanying publications like the Elsa Schiaparelli, but she's also contributed, published other things and contributed to other publications, including Fashion and Surrealism and Post-War American Textile Design. That was, those two essays were published in Surreal Things, Surrealism and Design, published by the V&A in 2007. She published the Textiles Essay and Catalog Entries in The Arts in Latin America, 1492 to 1820, published by the PMA in conjunction with Yale University Press in 2006. Painting by the Yard, American Artist Designed Textiles, 1947 to 1957. That's an essay that appears in Disentangling Textiles, published by Middlesex University Press in 2002. And The Fine Art of Textiles, the collections of the PMA Philadelphia Museum of Art in 1997. Dilys is also on the editorial board of Textile, the Journal of Cloth and Culture, Textile History, and West 86th Street. Dilys's talk this evening is entitled From Industry to Art, Collecting and Exhibiting Textiles at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and it will examine the textile collection from its beginnings as a resource for industry to recent projects with artists through the lens of acquisitions, displays, and exhibitions. So please join me in welcoming Dilys Blum.
So thank you very much. It's sort of exhausting to listen to what I've done over the years. I don't have time to do much writing anymore. I read things that other people have written. I'm going to start with the Centennial Exhibition, which is where the story of the Philadelphia Museum of Art begins. 1876, as I'm sure you all know, was the Centennial Exhibition. It was held in Fairmount Park, and the building you see in the center is Memorial Hall, which was the art gallery for the exhibition, and it was the big painting gallery. So this doesn't,
You try to go forward?
yeah, it's supposed to. There, sorry. This became the home of the new Philadelphia or Pennsylvania Museum and School of Industrial Art, which was founded the same year. This building remained the home of the museum, where it was known as the Pennsylvania Museum, until it moved to its new building around 1929. The museum was modeled on the Victoria and Albert Museum, the South Kensington Museum, as it was known then. And the purpose of the school, which was attached to it, was to furnish instruction in drawing, painting, modeling, carving, and designing. All the skills required by designers, superintendents, and workmen in the decorative arts. There was also a school of art needlework, which is surprising. That was only lasted for a few years, and the women who founded the school had come over from the Royal School of Art Needlework, but were so incensed by having the men dictate to them what their designs should be and how they should run the school that they separated themselves from the museum and eventually moved to another location. Actually lasted up until World War I. But the first school to be founded a little bit after that was the Textiles School in 1883. And textiles were the largest industry in Philadelphia, and the city produced more textiles than any other American city at the time. It was known for its wool, silk, and hosiery industries and its flexible manufacturing process. And this is just an example of what was produced in Philadelphia, which was one of the souvenirs of the Centennial Exhibition with Memorial Hall. The city's first textile industry was actually cotton printing, and this is the famous John Hewson bed cover. This is one we purchased a couple of years ago. It's the third that survives. One is at Winterthur. We have the first one, which descended in Hewson's family. This was actually in pristine condition, and it's quite remarkable when you actually see it, because all of the colors are still absolutely vibrant. But this was what Philadelphia was producing toward the end of the 18th, early 19th century. It continued its printing trade well into the 19th century, and this is an example of the kinds of things that were shown at the Centennial exhibition. They were produced by the Washington Print Works in Philadelphia in 1875, and these were called their chocolate prints, which were very popular, and in a way are quite similar to what was being produced in Philadelphia earlier, which were very small dress prints. The bed cover you saw is sort of an anomaly. Those were few and far between, most of which Philadelphia was producing were small dress prints. The museum's first collections were decorative arts, and this is a view of the Gallery Memorial Hall, which housed the Bloomfield Moore collection, which was the sort of seminal collection of the decorative arts in the museum. And it included a wide range of things: fans, jewelry, pottery and porcelain, metalwork, enamels, carved work in ivory and wood, tapestries, and pictures. And you can sort of get an idea of the sort of motley collection of objects that were on display. The fledgling museum also acquired many of the exhibits from the 1876 exhibition. An example is this Russian textile, lampas weave, which was on display in the Centennial. The major collection that the institution acquired were the India collections, which are quite interesting, and those include many printed cottons of the period. As I said, the textile school was founded in 1883, and within 10 years, its students actually were producing extraordinary work. This is an example of the kind of product that they were designing and manufacturing. And this is one of a pair of portieres that was exhibited at the 1893 Chicago Exposition, where it was declared the most complex design ever created on a jacquard loom in the United States. The whole point of the founding of the museum was to provide the textile industry with, and the design industry with good examples of design and manufacturing. And the textiles in particular were acquired at the very beginning as a resource for the study of design and technology. And this was one of the rooms of just student sketching, and they may have been in all different fields, not necessarily just textile design. We also had a study room, like most institutions, and actually, I look at this, I can actually recognize some of the textiles, and I'm sure it's all staff who are posed in this space. But the textiles that were acquired during this period were acquired with the help of the South Kensington Museum and followed the cataloging format that they established. So, for example, the emphasis was on Italian silks and velvets, on Ottoman textiles, on Persian textiles, very specific types of textiles that were regarded as sort of the high point of both technology and design. It was not until 1926 that the museum had its first exhibition of contemporary design. And it's interesting because this exhibition was actually culled from the 1925 Paris Exposition, but nothing ended up in the museum's collection. This, as you'll see later, was sort of the story throughout and really wouldn't be rectified until much later in the museum's history. We have acquired, though, a number of pieces, such as this is the Orinoco Mills textile based on famous Edgar Brandt gazelles that were shown in the 25 exhibition. So that exhibition did have an impact on Philadelphia manufacturing, even though the museum probably was not collecting anything remotely like this. This is something I purchased about 10 years ago. And we've continued to purchase examples of what the school and the museum should have been purchasing at the time, such as Sonia Delaney's textile from 1923. In 1928, the museum moved to its new building on the edge of Fairmount Park, and it continued under the name of the Pennsylvania Museum until 1938, when it was renamed the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The schools continued. They were not located in the museum, but had various sites in the city of Philadelphia, and that included both the College of Art, which remained, I think, until the 60s, and the College of Textiles. The College of Art today is part of the University of the Arts, and the Textiles is Philadelphia University. And these operated independently of the museum, but under its auspices at the very beginning. The first design show was in 1932, and it actually is a fascinating show. It was organized by Joseph Downs, who was an assistant curator at the museum and would later move to the Met. In fact, you find a lot of curators moving to the Met and other places after the stock market crash and the Depression. The museum had no money to keep on staff, and so unless you could afford to be a $1 a year person, you were going to find employment someplace else. So there are a number of other curators in both at Cooper Hewitt and at the Met that got their start at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The installation was conceived by Joseph Downs with the cooperation of members of the American Union of Decorative Artists and Craftsmen. And the catalog design was by Alexei Brodovich, who eventually moved to Harper's Bazaar. And the opening display was quite wonderful by Walter Dorwin Teague. There were about 200 designers, craftspeople, and manufacturers shown, and the curator for the exhibition was Charles Richards. He was the author of two early surveys, Art and Industry in 1922 and Industrial Art in the Museum in 1927. It was very well known in the field, and I'm sure many of you will run across his name if you're looking at design and industry in the early and mid-20s. There were textiles on display. I've yet to be able to find a list of what was shown, so if anyone recognizes anything here, but this is what was shown, and it really wasn't meant to be inspiration really for students rather than collecting for the museum. And the museum didn't acquire anything remotely like this at all during this period. What we were collecting were things like this. This was considered contemporary design, which is a commemorative textile of Lindbergh's transatlantic flight. And the impetus for collecting printed textiles, which is where the concentration was in terms of our textile collecting during the late 1920s and 1930s, was actually the first major exhibit of French printed textiles, which was held at the Met under Francis Morris, who was a curator there, and Henri Clouzot, who was at the Bibliothèque Fournie, who was an authority on French printed textiles, furniture, and also a dealer. And he helped the museum form two major collections of French printed textiles, one in 1929 and one in 1937, and these numbered about 456 printed textiles. And it's quite interesting because there's other collections at the Bibliothèque Fournie, but there's very little overlap in the three collections, the two that we have and the one at the Fournie. And because of this great emphasis on toile de Jouy and other French printed textiles, when this Richard Saja piece came available in 2011, I'm sure many of you know him as a contemporary textile designer. He does these wonderful embroidered textiles. This is called Sideshow. This fit right in with our tradition of collecting, textiles in the same vein. The only modern textile I could find was acquired in 1940, and this was this rug after Miro, produced by Marie Catoli, who's known for all the tapestries and rugs that she produced in conjunction with various artists like Miro and Arp and various others in the 30s and later. And this was actually purchased by Bernice Winterstein, who was the mother of Henry McElhenney, who became our very well-known curator of decorative arts. At the same time, Dr. Barnes was collecting Catoli tapestries, so there may be a connection there. But this is about the only contemporary piece that we acquired before 1946, 47. In 1947, we opened a suite of historic costume galleries. These were sponsored by the Fashion Group of Philadelphia, and this was a time in which, following the war, the fashion industry was really hoping to interest American consumers and the industry in promoting American fashion. And there was this concerted effort to promote fashion through museums. This included a gift of the latest fashions and accessories from 1947 by 13 prominent designers, none of whom were very avant-garde. There were Philip Mangione, Clara Potter, Nettie Rosenstein, Adrian, Tina Leeser. As you can see here, they were not exactly at the cutting edge. And shoes by Newton Elkins and hats by Louis Daché. It did, however, include one textile designer, June Groff. And June Groff was a Philadelphian who had studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of Art. And she had won in 46 fourth prize and an honorable mention in the Museum of Modern Art's textile design competition, which was for printed textiles for the home. And it's quite interesting because I found that the other prize winners included, who received honorable mentions, included people today we think of as major textile designers, including Marianne Strangle, Alexander Girard, and Ray Eames. So she bested all of them. But she hand-printed her textiles in her studio, and she was a great friend of Wharton Esherick. And this is the fireplace, which is earlier, but if you go to Esherick's house in suburban Philadelphia, you'll find a lot of her textiles there, and she was part of this group. But they all have this very interesting feeling to them. She also designed, her textiles were also used by some fashion designers during the period. In 1953, we opened our first gallery of 20th century fashion. And the television set you see there ended up in the collection. And I think there may have been a chair that also entered the collection. So that was sort of the beginning of the design collection. In the early 1950s, the museum received two major collections of modern art, the Arensberg collection and the Gallatin collections. And this was really transformative in that we were now collecting contemporary painting, sculpture, and decorative arts. This gift prompted a Philadelphia textile company known as Stapler Fabrics to produce textiles based on a number of the works in the two collections. And this was actually at a time in which many American manufacturers were trying to get consumers acquainted with modern and contemporary art. It was sort of an alliance between both art galleries and manufacturers. And the art galleries were the ones who were pushing their agenda through things like the Associated American Artists, Modern Master Print Collection, all of these that post-WPA meant that artists didn't have much of a way of earning a livelihood, and one way was to commercialize works from their collections. In 1974, we had our first exhibition of contemporary design, this contemporary British design, and it included 40 of Britain's top designers. 17 textiles were shown, and we acquired 8 of them. And it included work by Peter Collingwood, Shirley Craven, David Hicks, Peter McCulloch, and Zandra Rhodes. This is an example of the Shirley Craven for Whole Traders, which was included that year. It's from 1968. And the second is Zandra Rhodes, and we have quite a number of her early textiles, as well as many of the fashions that she designed later on. And since then, we've been filling in with things like Asher scarves. This is an example of it, that one of Henry Moore we acquired in a number of years ago. and John Piper's Foliate Heads from '55 for David Whitehead. And most recently, we acquired Evelyn Redgrave's personal design archive for heels. And this has some of her papers, but lots of interesting things that both she designed and this design director oversaw. One of the things that I have been doing, and I'm not quite sure how successful it's been, is to actually start trying to acquire smaller archival collections. Because we found that, for example, a little later, I'm going to talk about the major show on design, design since 1945, that many of these things, what we were not allowed to accession, later became really significant to the collection and to collecting generally. And when the Knoll exhibition was installed here at Bard, we had a lot of material that no one else had because things didn't get thrown away. They had been acquired for that particular special exhibition. But some of the other English, English textiles we acquired, Eddie Squire's Lunar Rocket. And, you know, a lot of these textiles you see like Lunar Rocket, Warner's Textiles was placing, and Eddie Squires in particular as design director, was placing their textiles in American collections. So a lot of institutions have some of the same pieces. I know Chicago has this, and several other institutions also have their fabrics. And that's true of things like Jacqueline Earl Larson as well. In 1984, Kathy Hiesinger, who's our curator of decorative arts, European decorative arts, organized design since 1945, and this was the first exhibition of American post-war design. The installation was designed by George Nelson, and it included 418 objects. The textiles were selected by Jacqueline Orr Larson, and it included his own designs, and this is his very famous remoulade, plus many others. And if you look through the catalog, you'll see the big names in textile design from this period, and usually they were the textiles that were published in the magazines and the architectural magazines of the time. Talking about Larson, one of the textiles that we have that was given to us in '46 from June Groff, or '47, was actually acquired by Larson, and he launched it as Spice Garden and in '54 and became his first printed textile. And she seems to have designed some textiles for him much later, but she was, I think, had a lifespan of about 25 years in his collection. This is an example of the installation, and you can see some of the fabrics on the walls. We have a couple of them, but the things like the Lucian Day I would have loved to have had. But a lot of these were borrowed. One example, early piece, we have Natalie Dupasquier from Memphis, 1982. It was, I think, one of the first Memphis textile designs. And it included a lot of Scandinavian textiles. Here you see Stig Lindberg's apples from 1952, and we have that in the collection. And recently we acquired another Stig Lindberg, his Melody from 1947. And also one of my favorite acquisitions in recent years, Stellan Morner's textile from 1954, which actually has gotten reproduced as a furnishing fabric in Scandinavia in print, but it's a really lush velvet that was used in an architectural setting, it was used as a stage curtain. In 1994, we had an exhibition of Japanese design, one of the first that I know of, a survey since 1950. And that was organized by Kathy Hiesinger and Felice Fisher, who was our curator of East Asian art. And this included 250 objects from posters to fashion and textiles. Most of the textiles were designs by Junichi Arai. And this installation, again, was designed by a noted architect, Kisho Kuokawa. Although we had some Japanese pieces in our collection. In fact, one of the most interesting groups are costumes or designs by Kansai Yamamoto from his very first collections, and this is an example from '71. And this is just one of the Miyake and Ron Arrad's the sort of vest chair that comes off and you can wear it. So. In 2000, I organized a small show in what was our craft corridor in the museum of contemporary fiber, and that was really the first time we gathered together any of our contemporary fiber pieces. Our fiber has been collected by several departments in the museum. American Art collected contemporary fiber in part because they were very much involved with the Philadelphia Craft Show, which had been sponsoring craft in an annual juried show, and they would raise the money they raised every year was used to purchase contemporary crafts, and most of what we acquired through the craft show coffers were American weavings and fiber art, as well as pottery and other kinds of crafts. This show was actually held because there was the Friends of Fiber Art and Surface Design Conference, and so it was a way of getting things together. And it featured work acquired since 1975. And if you can see here to the left is a Cynthia Shearer tapestry. The Yvonne Barberwitz actually was acquired by our contemporary art department. And the Sheila Hicks, which are her soft stones, which are in a box next to that. And at the very far end is Peter Collingwood's rug shaft switching, which was actually included in the Design Since 1945 exhibition. It gives you another view. And work by Ted Holman, this sort of stained glass piece, which was included in the bicentennial exhibition we had in 1976, and a piece with Ann Hamilton with the Fabric Workshop. And we do have a lot of Fabric Workshop pieces in the collection, although we haven't been acquiring them since the workshop is in Philadelphia, and we can borrow if we need to use or want anything to show in exhibitions. We have a large collection of Sheila Hicks. These two of them here, the Banisteriopsis you see in the foreground, in the middle, her prayer rug from 1966, and you see the Cynthia Shearer. This is an installation which is done called Crafting a Legacy in 2002. So the collection has many uses. This was, again, in the showcasing the crafts that had been acquired by the Women's Committee craft group. And this was celebrating American Craft 30 years of the craft show in 2006, and includes Lenore Tawney in the foreground, 1963. There have been other, sorry, you can't really see this, but our contemporary department has also been acquiring fiber art or tapestry. And this was an exhibition of Kentridge tapestries, and we acquired the one down at the very end of the gallery. We don't, at the moment, there's been a big discussion in the museum under the title of Contemporary Caucus, and we're discussing how we go about collecting things contemporary. There are lots of crossovers, and I think we all sort of agree that it's just the materials, mixed media, and we're all collecting in different ways, but we can all use one another's collections for different, in different types of exhibitions. In 2007, we opened the Perlman Building, which is across the street from the from the main museum. And this was a former insurance company, and it actually looks more impressive from the outside than it was originally. It was a very shallow building, and Gluckman Manor built onto the back, and so we have 3 new spaces to show photography, costume and textiles, and design, plus a special exhibition gallery. And we moved a lot of the offices over there, as well as administrative offices, as well as the curatorial spaces for prints, drawings, and photographs, and costume and textiles. And we all have our storage there, as well as some exhibition spaces. One of the shows that we did in the main museum in 2008 was the G's Ben Quilt Show. This was the architect for the quilt, which was the second show, and just gives you an idea of what we were, one of the installation shots from that show. But at the same time, in the Perlman Building, we did another show called Quilt Stories, and that showcased a group of African American quilts we had acquired, quite different from G's Bend, although it did include one G's Bend quilt by an anonymous quilt maker. These have been collected by a woman named Ella King Torrey when she was a graduate student at the University of Mississippi. And she worked with Maud Waldman, who's written quite extensively on African American quilts. And we acquired works by, for example, Sarah Mary Taylor, who was an applique quilt artist, and her famous Hands quilt, which appears in Oprah Winfrey film. And so it's quite another aspect of contemporary collecting. We have some contemporary quilts, which, for example, Louise Todd Cope's walking quilt, which sort of straddled this idea of being both fiber and art to wear. And this was actually created for the opening of the Helen Drutt Gallery in the early 70s. I guess it was in 2012, I organized an exhibition which I called Secret Gardens. And one of my ideas was to try to pull together different types of textiles under one umbrella. So handprints as well as fiber art. Because usually things get shown separately. We never show printed textiles with fiber art, and I was trying to break down the barriers visually. It was quite interesting to see what happened. On the left, you'll see some Ellen Hank textiles that we had acquired, I think, about the year before. And these were shown with a Ted Holman sculpture, fiber piece, which I later discovered was actually shown in a traveling exhibition called Threads of History in 1966, or one very similar to it. And this gives you an idea of the installation. Our gallery is only 2,000 square feet, and One of the problems we have in the space is that it opens onto a galleria that has so much light that we have to build baffle walls, because otherwise when you walk in you can't see anything. So this included the Ted Holman piece, Jim Hodges' curtain of flowers, which he produced in conjunction with the Fabric Workshop, Jack Lenore Larson piece at the very back left, and in the very back, Sheila Hicks piece, Turmoil in Full Bloom. And the June Groff textile that I showed you earlier that Larson had reissued. And it ended up being a very beautiful exhibition. People would just go in there and just sort of wander around and sit. And I think they were surprised at the kinds of things that we could pull together. For example, you have Dee Dee Tillett's Queen Anne's Lace from 1950 playing off Sheila Hicks' Wow Bush. The Wow Bush is just made up of nurses' uniforms that had been shredded, and it was a challenge to try to figure out how to install this, because Sheila Hicks had installed it in years earlier in one form, and like many of her works, they constantly evolve, and she's added to them. And this actually turned out to, I think, be very successful. It sort of mimicked one of the installations that she had. In 2012, Elizabeth Agro, who has recently, well, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, was appointed curator of American crafts. And she organized an exhibition in which she pulled together all of the crafts in the collection, from ceramics to glass to fiber, including a new acquisition by Rebecca Medell. And you can see it more clearly here. And this was a case in which several departments banded together to purchase this from the artist. And it's a very effective piece, and it requires so much space it's unlikely we will be able to display it in a gallery unless it's the sole object in the space. But hopefully, at some point it can go into the contemporary galleries. She's a professor in Philadelphia. Much of our collecting pulls out of the Philadelphia craft scene and Philadelphia colleges. There are many textile programs and fashion programs in Philadelphia. And we try to support local artists and craftspeople, many of whom are very well known. Ted Holman, for example, was teaching in Canada and Ontario. They've gone on to all kinds of other places. But at least it's affordable, I hate to say, but and also I think gives the community a real sense of what Philadelphia is up to. You don't have to be in New York to be able to be a successful artist. The tradition of, as I said earlier, of art needlework, which was something that we had the first school, and we acquired some embroideries, primarily samplers. One of the big collections we acquired was the Whitman sampler collection, and that has been probably one of our most asked for collections over the years. But I started buying other embroideries. Marion Stoll actually happened to be a Philadelphian as well, but she went on and lived in England. And some of her embroideries survive. And then recently we just acquired this piece by Liz Bayon, a ecclesiastical embroidery. And this came from a local priest who's been collecting contemporary vestments and ecclesiastical material. So, we're able to build on existing historical collections by adding things in usually through gift rather than purchase. We have very limited acquisition funds. One of the projects we worked on a couple of years ago was, and this is a little difficult to see, but this is the Rodin Museum. And I was given this photograph and asked if I could find the curtains that you see hanging in the windows on the right. And lo and behold, I was actually able to figure out what they were. And you can just about see here, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston happened to have an example of this. It was produced by Philadelphia Mill and very contemporary. And we reproduced them at Philadelphia University as a digital print with a student who had been a volunteer in my department at one point and worked for me. And it was just through one area that I recognized the image, which appeared in many magazines of the period. Much of our textile collecting also involves fashion. And of course, we have the collection of Elsa Schiaparelli, a gift from the designer in 1969. This is her lobster dress from 1937, and a later dress that she did from 46. And we just acquired a very large collection of textiles designed by Jean Pelletier and Suzanne Janine, who worked for Ducharme. And they produced about 40 some odd designs for Schiaparelli. And we have about 4 or 5 dresses with these textile designs, as well as textiles for other French couturiers. These are the large samples. The archive itself was purchased by Ratti in Como, Italy, and the person we bought them from was able to hold back the very large examples. And since it's unlikely that we're going to be able to find more Schiaparelli dresses made of printed textiles, a lot of these were used for linings, blouses, etc. To me, this was a good way of expanding the Schiaparelli collection in a slightly different way, and in a way where we could actually use the textiles in many of our other exhibition spaces. A lot of our contemporary textiles are used in the design exhibition space. Our design collection is enormous now, and it's sponsored by a group called CoLab. And Kathy Hiesinger has been doing wonderful exhibitions. For example, we have an exhibition by Vitra on at the moment, and she's always able to solicit gifts from manufacturers because they're going to be going on display. So some of our most interesting textiles have come through the CoLab exhibitions. We also collect outsider art, which again breaks the barriers between what you think of as textile, fiber art, or wearable art. This is part of an ensemble worn by an African-American artist named Charlie Logan. And it's actually on display now in the Folk Art Museum exhibition on performance art. He would unravel his socks and sweaters and embroider his clothes. And he embroidered his walking sticks, his jewelry, his hats, everything. And there were secret, hidden, the interior of his clothes also had hidden messages written in them. And so we've acquired a lot of things that don't quite fit into the mainstream of anything but what they are, but could also be exhibited in different kinds of spaces within the museum. And we've done quite a number of outsider art exhibitions, and that's one of our growing strengths. In 2011, I had the Roberto Capucci exhibition, and to me this was an exhibition that sort of bridged the gaps between art to wear, couture, fiber art. It was just about sculptural shape. Excuse me. This was a loan exhibition, and it was culled from Capucci's archives. And just as we were installing, we were actually able to acquire this dress from 1985. And it was the one show that Capucci had actually had in the United States. So we now own one. Most of his most extravagant designs still remain in his own archive. But one of the things I prefer doing is to do exhibitions of unknowns, and Capucci was an example. Even though he had been, considered a boy genius and traveled the States in the early 1950s, he'd been completely forgotten within fashion history, even though he is very well known in Europe. And the exhibition was, I think, quite eye-opening. People had never seen clothing like this before. And it was, as you can see, if I go back to the other, these are some of his earlier pieces. They're extraordinary to look at. All the pleats, the way he uses color, and these actually keep a shape. I mean, they're not particularly heavy. It's all in the construction. And he still produces and still has the same women who've been working with him for the last probably 50 years in some cases. Another show I did, which to me sort of bridges the gap between textile, fiber, and wearable, is a show we did a few years ago on Ronaldo Chamas called Form, Fashion, Reflection. And this looked at Chamak's use of Japanese references for origami, folding of fabric, his interest in dance. He designed many costumes for Lucinda Childs, and his friendship with the artist Jennifer Bartlett. And as you see, there's a Bartlett work at the back. And sort of playing off all of these things was a very interesting exercise. And working with a designer who I said he didn't make all of those connections, didn't see how all of this was interconnected until it was actually installed in an exhibition. One of the installations we did a couple of years ago was with Tristan Lowe, called Under the Influence. This was an exhibition that started out, or was first a commission for the Rhode Island School of Design Museum, which included this piece in the Galleria and this amazing felt moon. And Tristan Lowe had worked with the Fabric Workshop on another project with felting, and he's from Philadelphia. And for this, he designed the large door and a couple of other pieces. In 2013, we were told that we were going to have a summer of children's events. And we had something called Art Splash, which took place in the Perlman Building and was incredibly successful. It was a space for children to come in and just create under supervision. And I tried to think of what we could do which would be interesting for kids, which would also use the collection. And I worked with a local artist named Candy Coated, and one of the things I'd always wanted to display were our children's fancy dress costumes. And I couldn't think of how to do it where they wouldn't be boring and a little too historical. And so I asked her to make transform our gallery into sort of a wonderland. And so one of the things she did was to take make little slip covers with her signature decal prints on these bendy figures. And this is the space. She did wall paintings, decals. It was a very, very bright, this is overexposed. We had angels flying. It was a very interesting installation. And kids absolutely loved it. She's now moved out to California and left Philadelphia, but she's an artist who had a mobile screen printing workshop on the back of a bicycle where she would go around the city getting kids to actually learn how to screen print T-shirts.
So was that piece in the front of the 19th century?
Yeah, that's an early 20th century. So most of the fancy dress costumes were late 19th, early 20th century and came from just a couple of families. And then there were, toward the back, which you can't really see in this shot, were regional dress from around the world that people had brought back to their kids when they were traveling or sent back as gifts. But each one had the sort of signature screen-printed slipcover on the mannequin. And this is what we have up now. One of the things we have a study room in the museum, and we're always trying to encourage people to use it. For the most part, it's art colleges, art history, fashion history classes. But I've been trying to get artists to come and use our collections more frequently. And one of the artists I approached was a well-known Philadelphia artist named Shelley Spector. And she came in and just started, I'd been to one of her exhibitions and was very interested in the way she used pattern. And I thought she might actually be interested in looking at our sample books and some of our printed cotton textiles. So I asked her to look online and see what we have. And what she was drawn to was the Pennsylvania German samplers, and this particular piece by a woman named Frances Licton. Licton happened to be the head of the Pennsylvania WPA project, documentation project. And she was an illustrator and, again, had attended the academy like many of the textile artists in Philadelphia early in this, before 1945. And what drew her to this, and you can't quite read it here, is that Licton designed this piece, but had it her mother embroidered it. Her mother was 82 at the time. And it sort of represents a history of Pennsylvania. And Shelley is from a family that has roots in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, in the Philadelphia textile mills. And this appealed to her, and so Shelley started doing some research on Licton and discovered that Licton and her partner, Catherine Milhouse, sort of had a secret relationship that wasn't discussed. And Catherine Milhouse was a very well-known children's illustrator and book illustrator, and did posters and all kinds of things. And so I asked Shelley to develop an exhibition around her response to this. And this is what we have up now. It's called Keep the Home Fires Burning. And the title is from one of the letters between the two. And Shelley recycles material. All of these are made from found objects that she's reconstituted into new forms. Sampan chairs, the the hanging pieces are made from T-shirts, where she, cut up the T-shirts into yarn that she then developed a sort of crochet technique, which she learned from YouTube, to create these hanging pieces. And Shelley's mother, who's in her mid-80s, washed all of the textiles, would attach little notes to them telling her where the stains might be, pressed them, and unpicked them. And then Shelley used them in her sculptures. And these are the hanging pieces. And we've decided that we're going to put a rug underneath this so you can actually lie down and look up at the pieces. They're quite wonderful. And unfortunately, these are a little fuzzy. And then she has these 2 lines of Judah at the exit to the exhibition space, which are actually made from children's chairs and a shoe shine kit. And at the back, you see this sort of long vine, again made of T-shirts with, and at the base are big fabric tomatoes that she created. And she's doing a couple of workshops now, and we just had one with staff, creating these big fabric tomatoes, the kind they use for pin cushions. And you can either take yours home, or it can be installed in the exhibition. And so the mound is growing. There are 2 more events. And then she's taking those, doing a tomato intervention in the main museum on the mantels in some of our period rooms. And there's a Victorian custom of placing a fresh tomato or even a fabric tomato on a mantelpiece in the 19th century as a sort of welcoming event. And so that's going to happen. I don't know whether Amelia knows about that.
Never heard that.
Yeah. So these are the lions, and you get a sense. There's a little wishing well to the left. So that is it. So we get a sense that, I'm always trying to change our strategy for installing exhibitions now, in part to build a different audience. And we're finding that especially our younger audiences really like participating. When we did Craft Spoken here, we had a knitting and sort of craft workshop. You would just go in and sit and do your own thing, and that was people just come in and knit. And I think it is drawing a different audience. And I think people like to feel they're much more involved in the exhibitions. Coming up, we have a whole range of exhibitions. We've done a lot of fashion-related shows, which I've actually gotten a little tired of. And so we're now doing things like a chin textiles from Myanmar, India, and Bangladesh. We're going to be doing something African coming up. There are a whole range of different things, exploring other aspects of our collection. So stay tuned. And always, our website also has been, we're adding much more content to the website. So there are, for example, there are videos of us preparing things. When we did the Patrick Kelly, we had a video of staff dressing the mannequins, which we actually did in public, basically because we didn't have the space in our upstairs to do that. And it was actually accompanied by film clips we had of Patrick Kelly backstage. So it's a nice synergy. But there's more content. Our content is ending up more on the web at this point than in label copy and exhibitions. Our label copy, and I think this is true for a lot of institutions, we're down to like 50, 80 words. So, and even that, I notice people rarely read. So you need to go to the website to find more. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions or comments, or?
Yeah, no, thank you. I was going to open the floor to questions. I had a couple of questions. Some of which you may or may not want to. One has to do with, because I saw Dilys earlier today, and you were talking about, you've now been at the PMA since 1987, and, looking back, you can see that you can sense your taste.
Right.
In terms of what you've acquired and collected, and I
Right.
was wondering if you could talk a bit more about that. And also, because I recognized the source of some of those objects from the other place that I work. If you can talk a little bit about things that don't come in as gifts, things that you do have to acquire. And obviously, there's the one dealer on the east side that you come to, but are there others? And is there a specific mandate in terms of, collecting now, or?
Well, I'll start with the first one.
Okay.
When I first arrived at the museum, one of the things I realized that there had been a gap about 6 years when there hadn't been a curator. And I realized that we had a very strong textile collection. Although it had been out of sight for, probably stopped showing it in around 1947 when fashion came in. And I decided that as I started looking through it, that one of my concerns was that it could easily get deaccessioned, because a lot of it were fragments or small pieces. They weren't the grand pieces that you would use or expect to see in galleries. And I wanted to make sure that the history of that collection was sort of validated, and you could understand why it was important to maintain, 300 fragments of Italian velvet. I mean, the big pieces don't exist, and you're not going to find any more large pieces. So that gave me a good background in the history of collection, and I think I probably internalized all of that history in the way I started acquiring objects. Most of what we acquire is through gift rather than purchase, because we have very limited acquisition funds. And it's hard to find really great donations, as well as to find great purchases. I mean, you're so much at the whim of what is in vogue at the moment in terms of what shows up in sale rooms or is sold by dealers. And so that oftentimes you have to really take a risk in, finding things that may be sort of out of the mainstream. And usually I just go by my gut feeling as something. I tend to like things that are really strong, sort of gutsy, that are on the fringes of the objects. And I think, I've always felt that.
But are there also sort of like iconic pieces? I mean, you're saying
there are,
but you feel like you have to acquire, or you look for? Or?
Yes and no. I mean, I always figure lots of people have very similar collections. So if you want to borrow something, there's always a place where you can find it. What I guess I prefer collecting are the things that are sort of the outliers, that maybe are not quite yet in vogue, and we've done that with outsider art. We were one of the first institutions to actually collect a lot of that. That was sort of considered quirky, and I know in a lot of institutions would be difficult to get through your acquisition review. But luckily, we don't have a that reviews our acquisition. And I had a director at the time, Anne Darnincourt, who really responded to that kind of material, and she loved the oddities, and they still have to stand up, and be works of art, but they weren't easily classifiable. What was your other question? Oh, about where I
yeah, and also, right.
Yeah,
and if there is a sort of specific mandate for the department in terms of
no. Custom
we
and
need to have this,
custom
or-
and textile departments are below the radar. And I think they historically have always been that and continue to be. So people don't understand what we're collecting or why we're collecting it.
How much do you acquire for exhibitions versus,
Well,
just for the collection?
I mean, an exhibition usually can give a focus, and it also means that I can sometimes get money if it's for an exhibition. So you know, I think it's true of a lot of institutions. You end up collecting with an exhibition in mind, or because you're going to be doing an exhibition, you want to have an example of something. It'd be nice to have unlimited funds, or even more funds than I have to buy, but I always have to sort of buy, so I have to be careful about what I buy. I mean, always think of where I can show it and what it might relate to in the collection, and what kinds of combinations of things that, and it may not be really obvious. For example, I was looking, you know, have some Korean pieces, which I then, you know, was looking at a Miyake jacket. I mean, there are things that visually, you see visual connections between objects, but they might not relate in any other way but visually, but could make an interesting story at some point. And so much of, you know, exhibitions are just telling a story, you know, visually, going in and getting that sort of, you know, jolt when you look at a group of objects. And, you know, when you have 2,000 square feet, you can that's not a big space. You know, that you have to be really selective in what you put out. There has to be, you want to keep people going through. You don't just want them to go into the door, look and see everything, and then walk out again. So that's why I've been doing, I think, more contemporary shows, because people respond to that material much more. And part of that is the space in which we're showing. It's a new contemporary space, and historical material doesn't work. It works in the main building. Like for me to try to do an 18th century costume show, it would just be killed in the space that no matter what I did with it. So, you know, your exhibition, the exhibition space actually does a lot. And what is on the sides? I mean, there's a photography gallery, there's a design gallery. And, you know, people walk through those spaces going to each one, and then all of a sudden they're hit with the 18th century. They're not going to stay. You know, maybe you could do...
Certainly lingered in shopping in Paris.
Yeah, that was...
I know, that was different.
That was a little different, and that became more of a... Part of that was the title. And a good title, I think, can do a lot to getting, you know, people into...
But that had great material.
Yeah, it had great material, yeah. But it's hard. I mean, the shows that have worked well, Shamask worked very well. And when we did the Galanos, Ralph Rucci and Tessel show, because that was all about form. But I've learned that also you don't need to crowd shows, that the less is more these days. And the most successful shows I think are the ones where I have many fewer objects than I have. We have two other spaces. We have a study gallery in that building where we can do, Christina Haugland is the associate curator, does the study gallery. And so she has a shawl exhibition up now, shawls from the 1920s. So that's where you can actually do a very in focus, more didactic kind of installation. It's all in cases. And then we have a very small space in the main building, which only takes about 6 or 7 pieces successfully. And that, up until I moved into Perlman, was the only space that I had available. But I would, anytime there was a gap in the exhibitions schedule, I would raise my hand and said, I'll do it. And so ended up doing things on very short notice if something got bumped. So it's just sort of taking advantage of what was available. And I don't, I'm curious to see what happens next, because I think we're going to be changing the way we do exhibitions. the institution has a very small curatorial staff for the number of shows that we do. And, our department does, there are just two curators in my department. We do 4 to 5 shows a year. And that's a lot. And, everything's gotten more bureaucratic. So we have a director of interpretation now. And so things go through more hoops than they used to in terms of getting material out. So, I'm simultaneously working like 4 or 5 shows. And it's like every 3 months you have more label copy that has to go out. So when you said it was like a treadmill.
No, you said
I just said it like a treadmill, and it is. I mean, it's just, and you have to be able to come up with something really, good idea really quickly. So it's, curating's changed.
Yeah, I don't want to interrupt your conversation.
Oh, sorry.
I thank you for this talk. I want to say before I ask my question that I'm just an enormous fan of your museum and of the shows of yours that I've been fortunate not to see. So that's like my fan mail section. But I'm really interested in the history of the collection that you were talking about and the history of how it relates to the history of museums. And so I had like a basic question. You may have said this and I missed it. How many pieces are in the collection?
Oh, there are about 30,000.
And is that including textile and fashion?
Yes, about divided, 15,000 each.
Yeah.
And we've been de-accessioning really terrible things that should never. So it keeps on remaining 30,000, as we've said, for the last probably 20 years, even as we've acquired more.
And is that, I was going to say, is the term costume versus fashion?
No.
I'm just curious what you prefer.
This called textiles, costume, fashion. The costume is a more historic, and I think of it as like historic costume and then contemporary fashion. And then there's dress.
Right. We have these discussions a lot.
Yeah.
And then my other question really had to do with the history of the collecting. You did talk about this time period where you really weren't acquiring material that was contemporary to the moment, and then that eventually changes. And I'm curious about how different directorships might have affected that. So I'm interested in people like Fisk Kimball and then Marie Kimball, and how does that...
Well, Fisk Kimball...
His tenure is what, like 1920s?
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem was the Depression and World War II. So that really changed, there was no money to buy anything. I mean, I cry when I look through the files of these things that were offered. We don't have the money to buy them. They go to the Met or to Boston. So, I think there was a willingness to buy things, but there were never the funds. So most of what was acquired was through a lot through donation. And so that's, the big families in Philadelphia.
Does that also mean that you're strong on the trade?
Trade in terms of...
a sizable collection of, from a particular 2 or 3 particular manufacturers in the city.
In terms of fashion, costume?
Well, in terms of textiles or just...
Textiles, no. I mean, we have this huge sample book collection from William Simpson, who bought the Washington Print Works, where you saw the chocolate. Those are about the only sample. But mostly European. It's mostly European.
Well, I was just looking at some pamphlets from the school.
Right.
And the sort of 1916, 1918. And the links with industry are really, really strong.
Oh, very strong, but that's not reflected in our collection. I mean, when I found things, I tried to acquire them, like the Orinoco Mills fabric, but not very much comes up. And not things that you would necessarily want to collect. So,
in the historical collection of textiles, it seems like it's largely industrial design, and within the contemporary textile collections, it's like art and craft, contemporary and 20th century. So how does contemporary industrial design fit into your textile collection, and conversely, how does historical industrial design?
We still are
fit into the
collecting
design
industrial.
collection?
I mean, depending on how you define it, like new technologies. Like we have lots of Janichi Arai, that kind of thing, where there are new technologies that are, and it depends on what I can lay my hands on, and a lot of that comes under European Decorative Arts, under the collab, that they're able, when they're doing a show, they can actually get yardage from manufacturers for free. And those end up in the collection. And the industrial design early was, I mean, there's still good design, it's just they were used as industrial by the school as a reference point for production. So it's lots of small collections. Although there were some collections, for example, the Ottoman textiles, Persian textiles, which were very, during the 20s and 30s, they were considered significant of their time. The nomenclature that's used in the study of textile by technique, which is the Seattle vocabulary, started off in the museum. There's a woman named Nancy Andrews-Reed who rose from sort of secretary to curator, which was the trajectory in a lot of departments for women at the time. And she wrote a book called The Weaves of Hand-Loom Fabrics. And so there's a very interest at the very beginning in looking at structure and construction and understanding fabrics and identifying them from that point. And particularly with the Persian textile collection. And Eleanor Sachs, who wrote, did the major beginning research on Persian textiles, used those textiles as the jumping off point. But we had a lot of consulting curators from other institutions who helped. And it's hard to know whether their allegiances were divided, because I know what the V&A, for example, was commissioned to buy things for us, but often they ended up with better examples than we did. But the early history of the collection, if I don't know if you've seen the book that I wrote in 89 on the history of our textile collecting, because that's and there's a lot more that could be gleaned from that. But it's a very much a history of the industry in Philadelphia and in the United States. And the school was often had its own little exhibitions, and we took a lot of American Federation of Arts exhibitions early on as well. But I think that was just pointing, more pointing the school in a direction. The curatorial staff probably wasn't that interested.
Who initiated the contemporary caucus that you talked about?
It's been organized by Carlos Basualdo, who's our curator of contemporary art.
Okay.
And he received some money to sort of start getting people together to start talking about collecting, and it's not just curatorial staff. It involves individuals from different parts of the museum, visitor services, and we meet and hear speakers once every couple of weeks. And then supposedly we're supposed to come up with a sort of white paper on collecting.
Because it seems like fiber is a particular kind of concern in terms of all these departments like suddenly.
And it doesn't.
Yeah.
I mean, people don't call it fiber art. I mean, fiber art is
Right.
like Sheila Hicks' generation. Think of it as fiber art. None of the younger and newer. It's just mixed media. I mean, it depends on what department, what gallery is showing your work and how it gets promoted. You're just an artist, and that's one of the difficulties is that people still want to label, and
Well,
they
it's
really are
because
not
the
the
museum
labels.
has grown up with, distinct departments.
Right,
And so
yeah.
it's very hard you can't undo that unless you were, I suppose that the best you could do is jointly or collaboratively purchase objects.
Well, we did with that for Rebecca Miguel, for example. But we still use, they all get stored, most of them get stored in the costume and textile departments because we have the climate control, storage. We have the handlers the technicians who can work with it. But the issue becomes more getting people to use that material in other spaces. and just look at it as not being, just craft or contemporary art or, from the costume and textile department. Those are the harder, barriers to break down. They're still, and knowing what one another are collecting.
Yeah, like simple communication.
Yeah, which is not always easy. All of a sudden, just oh, you just got that. Well, that's interesting. I was thinking of, acquiring the same thing.
Might you be able to talk a little bit more about the Focus gallery that you were mentioning? The Focus gallery, the place, the space in which you present.
The study gallery?
The study gallery, yes.
Well, our study gallery is, I'm not sure how many square feet it is. It's probably, it's cases all around. And Christina is in charge of our study room and that gallery. And so she installs whatever she, might feel would be of interest to students. It's mostly geared to students. The one show I did do there was the little Kansai Yamamoto show, which was actually fun because that was like 1 year of a designer's life when he did something really interesting. And there were only I think 10 pieces in the gallery. But it's mostly costume or fashion. And then for the study room, we've divided the collection into smaller collections that teachers can use, like a great designers or underwear, or the teachers can teach from, and those are brought out for classes. And a part of that's just to make it manageable, because we get an awful lot of requests. There are not that many departments that are open to students. And, we sometimes have 3 or 4 classes a week coming in.
Yeah, my undergrad.
Undergraduate, yeah. And, it could be all kinds of students. It might be, a history class, or sometimes we get high school classes even coming in. So, the museum has a mandate to make the collections accessible, and that's one of the easiest ways to make them accessible. And then the small gallery across the street, I have had an exhibition assistant who's now leaving. But those spaces, we've been trying to do exhibitions with other curators. For example, we have a show up now that Laura Camerlengo did on Galanga and Italian glass. They're like 5 or 6 pieces, but just, where you're focusing in on just one aspect of something from the 1930s, 20s and 30s, that it's... And, those shows can take as much time as a bigger show.
Because we know from the Focus gallery here.
Right, yeah. It doesn't, the size makes no difference, except for physically dressing things and finding your labels, but in terms of the amount of work, it's about the same.
Why do you do so many shows? I don't, but like per year. 4 shows a year is a lot.
Because the galleries, the building has to stay open.
And for conservation reasons, you don't want to keep things.
Well, things are up for 6 months.
Oh, they are
Two
for 6
6-month shows in the main space. The study gallery is up for a year, and in 271 it's up for a year. And then if I want to do a special exhibition, that's a 3rd show, like Patrick Kelly.
Right.
So we resolved a little of that by using Patrick Kelly backstage, where we dressed in front of the public and then had these films of backstage of Patrick Kelly. So that actually took up some of the time. But otherwise, I have to keep the galleries open.
But you're doing more than 3 months. You're doing 6
Oh, yeah,
rotations.
we have to do 6. Yeah, we only have 2 curatorial staff, and that's it. and two conservators, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sort of 3 months is just comes and goes.
And I figure if they,
Work.
you know, it's all 5-foot candles, and most of these things have not been out in 75
Yeah.
years. There probably won't be.
I think we're heading towards that, the 6-month rotation.
And it's just too expensive, too. We don't have the kind of budget to be able to keep on rotating so many exhibitions.
Are there figures for, 3 and 6 month rotations? Because sometimes, at the Met, if you hear about something that's always the last week, right? It's always sometimes just takes, even with a big museum like yours, to get 3 months to kind of get everyone to know
I think
about
our
it.
conservators have been very strict for years, and I think they've realized that actually there isn't a discernible amount of difference with keeping something up for 3 months or 6 months. So I think we are beginning to think that these rotations don't have to be quite so frantic.
A balance between light exposure and the wear and tear of taking something, putting something up and taking it down. So that's started to think about those two features in opposition almost.
And maybe having fewer objects in here.
But Sarah's got something to say.
I think the conservators would welcome more lag time between exhibitions as well.
I mean, it's a terrible treadmill to be on.
Yeah, it is.
By the time you get something up, you have to be halfway through the next show.
I mean, I think
Yeah,
they've
it's
done
just this-
right, and the pieces are right, and the mounting is right,
Right.
the light levels are right.
I can stay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And, also, you just maybe have fewer objects so that you're saving some for the next time. Well, we have a show of the Art of Kano, a Japanese show, which is a special exhibition, and they're rotating 3 times. I mean, part of that is because it's a lone show and they're national treasures, but this idea of rotating, and it's a huge exhibition. And it's all these glass cases, and they do it in like a day and a half, having 2 rotations.
It seems like there are different traditions at the Met, at least, because the Asian art do many more rotations than we do, and seem to be much more anxious about exposure. I'll put up samples for a year and they're fine. So it seems there's a different tradition within the Asian art world about how often you have to rotate.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
It does go to the
Then we have
history.
rugs that have been on display
What is
for
this?
25 years. Yeah.
Well, just the history of the
Yeah.
displays, the light exposures. Like the cumulative time, how many times has it been displayed? Maybe trying to limit that. What we're noticing, I mean, it's my colleague Laura here, she's working on a dress that's been displayed 8 times already.
Oh,
And
the
it's going to
matchlock?
be the Revolt Française with the pagodas, and it'll be displayed in our China exhibition, and it's suffering. And frankly, we don't have the time to put in a holistic treatment. And so it's triage, treatments every single time, and it's getting in worse and worse condition, but it's never not going to be chosen because it's such a great piece. So what do you do? Get off the treadmill.
That's what we're going to doing other kinds of shows now. I mean, it's wonderful having this such a broad collection to draw from, because you can do all kinds of combinations of things. Just need time to think about it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.